Our sources touch on how environmental factors like climate have played a role in the physical variations we observe in people across the globe.
What's fascinating here is that one of the articles specifically mentions skin color. It points out how skin tone gradually changes as you move from Europe towards the equator in Africa.
Right, and it's not like there's a sharp line where skin color suddenly shifts. It's a continuous gradient, or what one of the sources calls a climb.
Exactly. And this climb in skin color is strongly linked to the intensity of ultraviolet radiation from the sun. People in regions with more intense UV have, over generations, developed darker skin as a natural protection.
And another one of our sources, the YouTube video from the Story Desk, talks about nose shape.
Oh, that's right. It explains how nose shape can be related to climate as well.
Yeah, they mention how in colder, drier climates, like in Europe, longer noses help to warm and humidify the air before it reaches your lungs.
Whereas in hotter, more humid regions, like in parts of Africa, wider noses are more efficient for breathing in already warm air.
So climate has definitely been a selective force, shaping some of our physical traits over long periods.
But what's crucial to remember, and what our sources emphasize, is that these climate-related variations are just one aspect of human diversity. They don't create these clear, separate races in a biological sense.
That's a really important point. These are gradual adaptations to different environments, and they don't define the entirety of human genetic variation.
This raises an important question, doesn't it? Oh yeah, oh, that's another excellent question. It seems you're really thinking about how our environment has shaped us.
We love that. And yes, our sources actually have quite a bit to say about how climate has influenced hair.
What's fascinating here is that one of the YouTube videos we looked at from Cheddar Squared directly addresses this.
Exactly. They explain that humans originated in Africa, which, as we know, is a pretty hot place with intense UV radiation.
And according to that video, the tightly coiled hair texture, common among many people of African descent, evolved as a protective mechanism.
Right. The coily and less dense nature of the hair helps to shield the scalp from that harsh UV light.
Plus, that same video points out that the structure of coily hair allows for better airflow to the scalp, which helps keep it cooler in hot climates.
So just like with skin color and nose shape, hair texture appears to be another adaptation to the environment.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it reinforces the idea that many of the physical traits we associate with different ancestral groups have roots in adapting to different climates.
But just like before, it's so important to remember that these are gradual adaptations and don't define separate biological races.
This raises an important question, doesn't it? Well, go for it. Another fantastic question. You're really making us think about all the ways our bodies have adapted.
Absolutely. And while our sources don't go into as much detail about eye shape specifically in relation to climate,
they do touch on how environmental factors can influence the development of certain physical features.
For example, one of the YouTube transcripts we looked at mentioned eyeball size.
That's right. It explained that people in Northern Europe with long winters and low light tend to have larger eyeballs.
And the reasoning is that larger eyeballs can collect more light, which helps with vision in darker conditions.
And this adaptation for collecting more light also requires a larger visual processing center in the brain.
Which is a fascinating example of how climate can indirectly influence even the size and function of parts of our heads.
So while the sources don't directly discuss eye shape and climate,
this example of eyeball size and light availability suggests that climate can indeed be a selective pressure on our visual systems.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's another piece of the puzzle showing how humans have adapted to diverse environments over time.
And it reinforces that idea that many of the physical differences we see have roots in these adaptations.
But again, it's so important. Oh yeah, go on.
Oh, that's a really interesting question. It touches on something one of our sources actually mentions directly.
It does. The YouTube transcript we looked at from Zach B. Hancock specifically addresses the idea of skull and brain size.
And it points out that while people in Northern Europe tend to have larger eyeballs due to low light conditions,
requiring a larger visual processing center in the brain,
the source is very clear that this has nothing to do with intelligence.
Absolutely. It emphasizes that differences in skull and brain size are related to many factors,
like overall body size, climate, and even eyeball size itself, as we were just discussing.
So according to this source, a larger eyeball size, driven by the need to gather more light, doesn't equate to greater intelligence.
It's a specific adaptation for a particular environmental condition, not an indicator of cognitive ability.
What's fascinating here is how easily physical traits can be misinterpreted and linked to things they have no actual correlation with.
Exactly. And this connects to a broader point our sources make about the dangers of trying to draw conclusions about complex traits like intelligence based on superficial physical differences.
So to directly answer your question, the source material we've been looking at indicates that eyeball size is not a reliable indicator of intelligence.
It's a great example how we need to be careful about making assumptions based on physical variations.
And it leads us back to the idea that these physical traits, often shaped by the environment, don't define these clear-cut racial categories we were discussing.
Right, they're gradual changes within the human population.
And they don't create these clear biological boundaries between different racial groups.
This raises an important question, doesn't it? While climate has influenced... Yep, go on. That's a great point. You're absolutely right. Our sources definitely highlight how climate plays a role in hair texture.
What's fascinating here is that the YouTube video from Cheddar Squared we looked at specifically talked about that.
Exactly. It explained how the tightly coiled hair, often seen in people of African descent, is thought to be an adaptation to the hot, sunny climate.
The video mentioned that the coily texture and less density help protect the scalp from intense UV radiation.
And it also pointed out that the structure allows for better airflow, which can help keep the scalp cooler.
So you're spot on. Climate is definitely considered a factor in the evolution of different hair textures, like straight and coily hair.
It's another example of how environmental pressures can lead to these gradual physical variations across populations.
But as we've been discussing, it's important to remember that these adaptations don't create rigid racial categories in a biological sense.
Precisely. These are just some of the many ways humans have adapted to diverse environments over long periods.
This brings us back to the question of how these geographic...
Hey, yeah, what's up?
That's a really insightful question. You're making us consider even more subtle physical variations.
We love your curiosity. While our sources don't directly address lip thickness and climate,
We can think about how other facial features have been linked to environmental factors.
for example, we talked about nose shape and its connection to humidity and temperature.
It stands to reason that other exposed features, like lips, could also be influenced by climate over long periods.
Perhaps as a form of protection against sun or dryness. It's definitely something to ponder.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it highlights how diverse environmental pressures could shape a range of our physical traits.
But just like with everything else we've discussed, these gradual adaptations wouldn't create distinct biological races.
This brings us back to the central question of how these geographically influenced traits relate to the social categories we call race.
Well, that's exactly where things get really interesting and what we were planning to delve into next.
If we connect...
Oh, yeah,
That's a really central question. You're getting right to a key way climate influences us physically.
Absolutely. Our sources actually have quite a bit to say about how climate directly affects skin shades.
What's fascinating here is that one of the main reasons for variations in skin tone across the globe is the intensity of ultraviolet, or UV, radiation from the sun.
Right. Areas closer to the equator receive much more intense UV radiation.
And as one of our sources, the Wikipedia excerpt on melanin explains people whose ancestors lived in these high UV regions for long periods developed darker skin.
Okay, let's unpack this. Why darker skin?
Well, melanin, which is the pigment responsible for skin color, acts like a natural sunscreen. The more melanin you have, the darker your skin, and the better protected you are against UV damage.
Here's where it gets really interesting. That same source notes that eumelanin, one type of melanin, is more abundant in tissues needing photoprotection, like the epidermis, the outer layer of our skin.
Exactly. So, over generations, natural selection favored individuals in high UV areas who had more eumelanin and those darker skin because they were better protected from things like sunburn and skin cancer.
So the darker skin shades we see in populations near the equator are a direct adaptation to protect against strong sunlight.
Conversely, as humans migrated to areas further from the equator with less intense UV radiation, the selective pressure for dark skin decreased.
And in those regions, lighter skin actually became advantageous.
Precisely, because UV radiation is also needed for the body to produce vitamin D. In areas with less sun, lighter skin allows for more efficient vitamin D synthesis.
So skin shade is a really direct adaptation to the amount of sunlight in a particular environment.
What's fascinating here is how this single factor, UV radiation, has driven this significant variation in one of our most visible traits.
So to directly answer your question, climate, specifically the intensity of UV radiation, directly affects people's skin shades through the production of melanin as a protective adaptation.
And this is a prime example of how environmental factors have shaped some of our physical characteristics over long periods.
But as we've discussed, these gradual adaptations in skin shade don't create these sharp biological divisions we call races.
This brings us back to the central question of how these geographically influenced traits relate to the social categories we call race.
Well, that's exactly where things get really interesting, and what we were planning to delve into next.
These climate-related traits, like skin shade, are often what people historically used to define racial groups.
But as the sources show, when you look at the whole genome, those lines become really blurry.
What's fascinating here is that the number and location of any described races really depend on which traits you decide to focus on.
Okay, let's unpack this. So even something like skin color, hair texture, even nose and maybe eye shape, and potentially lip thickness, which might seem so obvious, they're just a few traits that vary gradually.
Precisely. As one source pointed out, Europeans and East Asians might both have relatively light skin, but they owe it to different genetic mutations that arose independently.
Here's where it gets really interesting. If you look at other genetic markers like blood types, the groupings might look completely different.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Europeans and Africans are genetically closer in terms of ABO blood groups than either is to Chinese populations.
So what does this all mean? It means that trying to draw rigid racial boundaries based on a few visible traits influenced by climate doesn't really hold up when you look at the broader genetic picture.
This raises an important question about how these geographically influenced traits were then used to create social hierarchies and the concept of distinct races.
Exactly. So while climate has definitely played a role in shaping some of our physical characteristics, the way we've categorized people into races is a much more complex story.
And as we were saying, it's really tied up with historical, social, and political factors, which we are about to explore in more detail.
So thanks again for all your incredibly insightful questions. They've really helped us build a solid foundation.
What's fascinating here is how a few observable traits, sometimes influenced by climate, became the basis for these much broader and often rigid social categories.
Okay, so our mission today is to sift through all of that, to unpack what these sources are telling us about how race gets defined, how it's understood, how it's lived.
Yeah, and maybe most importantly, what happens when identity seems to push against those boxes, especially when people talk about actually changing race.
Let's unpack this.
Okay, so maybe the best place to start is right at the beginning. How did this whole concept of race, as we think of it now, even come about?
Because the sources are pretty clear, this isn't some ancient idea. It's relatively recent, really tied up with European exploration, imperialism, colonization, starting around the 16th century.
Right, so not just observing difference, but using it.
Exactly. It became a tool, a way to sort people into groups, often to, well, create hierarchies and justify some pretty awful practices like the subordination of African people through slavery.
Yeah, the sources show how quickly race got tangled up with power, with social control. One article mentions that contrasts not just physical, but ideas like civilized versus uncivilized.
Mm-hmm.
And that fed right into things like social Darwinism, didn't it? Basically saying some groups were, inherently better or more evolved.
Yeah, a very convenient argument if you're a colonial power trying to justify dominating other people. It sets up this us versus them.
And that historical background, that construction, it's so important because it suggests race was maybe a social and political idea first, right? Before people tried to layer biology onto it.
That's a key takeaway from those sources. And speaking of the biology, that's where things get really interesting. According to the research you shared, there's been a huge shift.
A shift? How so?
Well, one piece looked at textbooks, 20th century textbooks. Early on, like early 1900s, physical anthropology texts were confidently mapping out distinct human races. Biologically distinct.
Okay, standard stuff for the time, I guess.
Right, but then fast forward to the 1970s, those same kinds of texts were arguing the opposite, that distinct biological races just don't exist in humans.
Wow, that's a big turnaround. What about biology textbooks?
They often just stopped talking about it. Seems like they maybe wanted to avoid the controversy, the political heat around things like subspecies. Easier to just drop the topic than reverse course explicitly.
So science itself started questioning the biological basis.
Massively. And that powerful phrase from one source really sums up the modern genetic view. The concept of race is biologically indefensible.
Biologically indefensible. That's strong. Why? What's the core reason the sources give?
It really comes down to the genes. We see physical variation, of course, skin tone, hair, features, but genetically, the sources stress humans share an overwhelming genetic similarity.
Overwhelming.
That's the word they use. And the variations we do see, they just don't clump together neatly into those old racial boxes. You actually find more genetic diversity within a group called a race than you do between different so-called races.
So those neat lines people drew, biology, or genetics at least, doesn't really back them up, according to these sources.
Pretty much, though it's fair to say one video source we looked at did mention, while this is the strong consensus now, there are still nuances, ongoing discussions among experts. It's not like every single scientist agrees on every fine point.
Sure, science is always evolving, but the main thrust in these sources is definitely away from a biological basis for race.
Definitely. And then the sources bring in ethnicity.
Ah, right. How does that fit in?
Well, ethnicity tends to focus more on shared culture, language, history, origins, rather than just physical traits assumed to be biological.
Okay, so a different angle. But is it less problematic?
Not necessarily, according to one critique mentioned. Sometimes focusing on ethnicity, especially if you start talking about a group's cultural defects as the reason for inequality.
I see where this is going.
Yeah, it can become a way to ignore the bigger picture, the structural problems, the systemic racism, the social and political systems that actually hold people back.
It sort of shifts the blame onto the group's culture instead of the unfair system they're in. Like that source said, it allows for a kind of benign neglect of inequality.
Exactly. So whether it's the old race concept or the ethnicity focus, these categories can be used in ways that mask the root causes of problems.
And this is where things get really tricky conceptually, based on what a couple of the sources were saying about gender versus race.
Yes, this is a really crucial distinction they draw. With gender, especially now, we often talk about biological sex, the body, and gender identity, that internal sense of self as potentially separate things.
Right, that distinction is quite common now.
But with race, the term itself, historically and often in everyday use, seems to bundle the physical body and the social role or identity altogether. There isn't that same widely accepted separation.
Ah, okay, so it's harder just using our common language and ideas to talk about having a racial identity that's separate from your physical appearance.
We don't really have a common framework for saying you feel, black inside or Asian inside, in the same way we talk about gender identity being internal, potentially different from assigned sex.
Precisely. That lack of separation, that conflation, makes the whole idea of changing your race, especially if it involves physical changes, way more complicated and controversial for many people.
Compared to changing gender, where that body identity distinction is more available.
Which brings us right to transracial identity.
Exactly, as it's discussed in the sources, and they're careful to note this is a new use of the word transracial. Historically, it meant cross-racial adoption.
Got it. So this new usage describes people who identify with a race different from the word they were assigned at birth.
That's the definition they use. And these individuals might, take steps to align how they look and how they present themselves socially with that identified race.
That could mean tanning, makeup, hair changes, sometimes more significant physical alterations, and also maybe immersing themselves in cultural activities tied to that identity.
Okay. And this is where that comparison to transgender identity comes up strongly in the sources, right? And causes a lot of debate.
A huge amount of debate. Like, is transracialism real? Is it valid in the way that transgender identity is increasingly seen as valid?
Some arguments in the sources suggest maybe societal acceptance shouldn't depend on proving if identity, race, or gender is purely biological or purely social.
How so?
Well, one philosophical piece argues strongly against demanding biological proof for accepting gender identity. They say that's unjust.
And they extend that, suggesting maybe acceptance of transracial identity shouldn't be held up by these biology debates either. If it's a deeply felt internal sense, perhaps it deserves consideration on its own terms.
That's a challenging idea, but despite those arguments for acceptance, the sources are pretty blunt about the reality, aren't they? There's a lot of suspicion.
Oh, absolutely. Widespread suspicion, rejection even. One source just calls it a knee-jerk position for a lot of people.
Especially maybe in the U.S. context, where messing with your assigned race is often met with instant skepticism, if not outright hostility.
And you really see that reaction when specific cases hit the news. The sources mention a couple of prominent examples.
They do. Martina Big is one, a German woman, originally white, who now identifies as black.
Right, I remember seeing stories about her.
The sources, including an interview transcript, they touch on her perspective. She talks about feeling black inside, not just changing her appearance and believing every color has a place to be.
The interview also mentions the significant physical changes she's undergone, like saline implants that expand over time.
And that interview transcript also gave a peek behind the curtain of media coverage, didn't it?
It really did. She described feeling kind of set up by a big TV show.
And the other big case mentioned is Rachel Dolezal.
Yes. And one source makes a really interesting comparison between her public reception and Caitlyn Jenner's.
How do they compare them?
Well, gender transition while controversial for some, largely became a moment for broader discussion, even acceptance of changing gender.
Dolezal, however, her situation, especially because of what people saw as deception.
Right, the fact she presented as black when her parents revealed she had white ancestry.
Exactly. That role of deception, as the source puts it, seemed crucial. For many, she became a symbol of the, quote, absurdity of changing race.
The rejection was much faster, much broader.
So that element of perceived dishonesty seems key in the public reaction, according to that analysis.
It appears to be a major factor, distinguishing the Dolezal reaction from the often less hostile reception for many trans people.
Okay, so beyond these really public figures, the sources also looked into online spaces, right, where people who identify as transracial actually talk to each other.
Yeah, places like specific subreddits, Discord servers, trying to get a sense of the lived experience, not just the media controversies.
And what did they find there?
Well, they shared one post, a really personal story from a user born white who strongly identifies with Japanese culture.
What was their experience like?
They described feeling this connection really young, being bullied for it, using makeup and hair dye to try and change their appearance.
And finding real happiness when people actually perceived them as Asian.
Wow. So a deep internal feeling.
Very deep. This user literally wrote they would like to be like them, meaning people of Asian descent.
And asked, why can't we be the race we choose? They even compared it to being transgender.
Feeling the roots might be similar and saying they hated taking off the makeup because it felt like losing their real self.
It really highlights that sense of internal identity.
That personal perspective really brings home the intensity of it, and it connects back to that ethical debate one source raised, particularly about white to black transitions.
Right. The white privilege argument.
Can you unpack that argument as presented in the source?
The core concern is that someone born white, with the societal advantages that often come with that, might transition to identifying as black, but could potentially still hold on to some of that privilege.
Or maybe even opt out later if things get too difficult. Essentially, benefiting from or appropriating black identity without the lifelong weight of systemic anti-black racism.
That's a serious ethical concern grounded in real history. But the source offered a counter-argument too, right?
Not to dismiss the concern, but to question using it to shut down the possibility entirely.
It did, and it's a provocative counter. The source suggested, look, if you apply that logic strictly, you shouldn't transition. If you might retain some birth privilege, couldn't you argue similarly about many trans women?
How so?
Well, men as a group tend to have systemic advantages in society, in careers, safety, status.
So the source asks, should concerns about a trans woman maybe still having some residual male privilege invalidate her identity or transition?
The argument presented is that most people would say, no, that's not fair.
Okay, so the source is drawing a parallel, arguing that dealing with privilege, whether it's white privilege or male privilege, is maybe a separate battle.
Exactly. A battle about dismantling those privileges for everyone, achieving equal access.
Rather than a reason to block or invalidate someone's deeply felt identity or transition, be it gender or potentially race.
It frames privilege as a societal problem to fix, not an individual barrier to identity.
That's the core of their argument, and they briefly mention figures like Michael Jackson or Lil' Kim.
Whose major appearance changes touched on race and aesthetics, suggesting maybe altering racial presentation isn't exclusively a white to black thing.
Though those cases are complex, not necessarily clear-cut transracial identification.
Interesting. And thinking about appearance, the sources did briefly touch on some actual biology, like hair differences, which we just discussed, thanks to your great questions.
Yeah, just descriptively. Mentioning hair structure, medulla, cortex, cuticle, and noting how things like diameter and cross-section shape show general patterns across different ancestral groups.
Like, flighter cross-sections, often in African ancestry, rounder in East Asian.
Right, and melanin's role in color. Just noting these observable physical variations.
But crucially, as we talked about earlier, the sources emphasize these are variations within humanity. They don't neatly carve out distinct biological races.
Exactly. They're gradients, variations, not fundamental divisions.
And the sources also point out how much our perception of traits like hair is shaped by culture and history.
Used to signal status, identity, completely separate from the biology.
It always comes back to that social layer, doesn't it?
It really seems to. And speaking of lived experience, one source made a really vital point. The black experience is not monolithic.
Yeah, that's so important. It pushes back against stereotypes.
Absolutely. The source acknowledged that while, yes, many black individuals face frequent, undeniable racism,
Others might experience very little overt racism, depending on so many factors.
recognizing that diversity within a group is key.
It's crucial for any nuanced understanding. And the sources also touched briefly on some deeper cultural stuff.
Like the historical association of blackness with evil, maybe linked to a primal fear of darkness.
And that paradox for people of color living in societies where the main image of God is often white.
Yeah, creating a kind of disconnect between dominant spiritual imagery and their own reality.
These deep cultural currents likely play a role in how society reacts to racial difference, and maybe to attempts to change race.
One source even floated a psychological idea about empathy.
Right, that maybe we struggle to empathize with people who seem very different from us. It's just harder to put yourself in their shoes.
Which, the source suggested, might contribute to that knee-jerk suspicion towards transracial folks we talked about.
It's one possible factor they raise. And finally, there was that philosophical distinction about types of racism.
Intrinsic versus extrinsic.
Yeah, intrinsic racism was described as maybe a natural group preference, favoring your own community.
Which some argue isn't necessarily directed against others, contrasted with extrinsic racism, which is based on irrational negative beliefs about other groups that lead to disadvantaging them.
Just another way the sources try to analyze the complexities of prejudice.
Okay, wow, so we've covered a lot of ground. History, biologist shifting, personal identity, societal reactions, ethical debates.
Pulling all these threads from the sources together, what's the big picture that emerges?
I think the overwhelming picture is that race is incredibly complex. It's not this fixed biological fact we might have assumed.
It's something historically constructed, something modern science largely doesn't support as a neat biological category. And yet, it has profound, undeniable impacts on people's identity and their experiences in the world.
And that whole discussion around transracialism, even with all the controversy, especially linking it with transgender identity.
The sources suggest it really throws a spotlight on the, what was the phrase? The deep contingency and arbitrariness of racial categories.
Exactly. It makes you question how solid those categories really are.
Are they natural? Or are they things we as societies have built and agreed upon perhaps more fluidly than we realize?
It forces us to think about where the boundaries come from. Are they biological, or are they more about social agreement, history, power, and maybe very deep personal feelings?
That seems to be the core tension the sources reveal.
This is definitely a deep dive. We've gone through the history, the science, the personal stories, the controversies around race, identity, and the idea of changing it, all through the lens of these sources.
And I think where it leaves us, especially if we take seriously the sources suggesting racial categories are largely social constructs, and that identity can be this powerful internal feeling, it leaves us with some big things to think about.
It really does. It raises that fundamental question. If the lines of race are more arbitrary than we thought, and identity can feel so deeply personal and internal, what does that actually mean?
How should we define ourselves? How do we define community? And how should society respond to people who feel their true identity lies across those historically drawn lines?
It's a profound question to sit with. Thanks for joining us for this exploration.
It's been a thought-provoking journey. Until next time, keep those questions coming.